Africa and elsewhere. Chapter 3 mentioned some medieval Arab characterizations of Africans. The first European explorers to encounter African Negroids also found their most salient traits to be present orientation and absence of intellectual curiosity. Baker cites some characteristic descriptions. Quote, Livingston writes of the Bechuana, for instance, "No science has been developed, and few questions are ever discussed except those which have an intimate connection with the wants of the stomach." Generalizing more widely, he remarks, "All that the Africans have thought of has been present gratification." Finn, too, tells us that he seldom found any Zulu gifted with the inquisitiveness that makes people interested in knowledge, apart from the possibility of its immediate application to the practical affairs of their lives. Livingston found that the Barotse had retentive memories on which they could rely for information about events that they themselves had actually witnessed long ago, but he found little evidence anywhere of foresight or thought about the distant future. De Charles writes of the utter improvidence of the Gabon tribes, and Specky expresses the same idea when he says that the Negro thinks only for the moment. It would be a remarkable coincidence if oppression in the United States produced the same traits found among indigenous Africans unexposed to whites. The cause of the present-orientedness and lack of intellectual curiosity in blacks in Africa may be assumed to be the same as the cause of comparable traits found in American blacks. Lynn, 1991, surveys 11 studies conducted between 1929 and 1991 on approximately 6,000 African children and adults, most using some form of the nonverbal culture-fair Raven's matrices. The weighted average IQ for blacks in these studies is 73.3, with the mixed race group performing intermediately. I believe the official IQ to be considered retarded in America is 70. So 73 is a pretty bad average. Just a reminder, the average white IQ in America is 100, and the average black IQ is at 85. Since the IQs of contemporary African blacks are about 2 standard deviations below those of contemporary American whites, with American blacks intermediate, the phenomenon of low black IQ in Africa or the United States is unlikely to be due to an oppressive environment. To attribute the white African difference to colonialism implies that whites have had a large effect on blacks in a short time, implying in turn a marked black-Asian difference. Contact with Europeans, including extensive colonization, did not lower Asian IQ 2 standard deviations below white norms. Further, appeal to colonialism overlooks the need to explain Europe's total domination of Africa. To say that Europeans had better weapons begs the key question, namely, why European weapons were better. Why hadn't Africans invented explosives or the science of ballistics? Medieval European weapons, tactics, and discipline were inferior to those of the armies of Genghis Khan, and overtook Asian war-making capabilities only after the rise of modern science, itself a development that may reflect genetic differences. Definitely reflects genetic differences. If biological explanations of cultural differences are reductive, an issue taken up in the next chapter, we begin to see why cultural explanations of cultural differences are circular. In other words, if you say that a population's military capability is low because they don't have a culture of military capability, why not? That's not really an explanation. What causes culture? Culture is an external expression of an internal factor, genes. There are also striking parallels on non-cognitive factors between blacks in various parts of the world. In Chapter 3, I mentioned that when allowed to choose between getting a small candy bar immediately or a large one later, black Trinidadian children tended more than non-black children to choose the near-term reward. Africans displayed the pattern of loose pair bonding and limited parental involvement found in American slums. Quote, "There persists high fertility and a pattern of parental investment in which both mothers and fathers invest, by Western standards, relatively little in each offspring and pursue a pattern of delegated parental responsibility. a mating pattern that permits early sexual activity and loose economic and emotional ties between spouses. The parents themselves do not expect to be the major providers for each offspring throughout the children's lives. The norms regarding male domestic roles do not emphasize conjugal interdependence nor intimate involvement by fathers in the rearing of children. This pattern continues in cities and shows few signs of changing under the influence of modernization. The psychological, social, and spatial distance of husbands and fathers, together with their freedom from direct economic responsibility, relieves them of most aspects of the parental role as Westerners understand the term. The literature on the Nilotic and Niloticized Bantu-speaking tribes of East Africa and the Fulani peoples is fairly consistent. Domestic arrangements preserve this pattern. The typical African pattern is to terminate intense care of the child early, by Western standards, in the child's life. As a woman enters her post-reproductive years, she is less and less likely to have a man who is making financial contributions to her support. End quote. Draper, 1989. Although difficult to quantify, the character of an isolated society, determined as it is by the genotypes of its members expressed in a given physical environment, indicates its members' innate qualities. There are obvious differences between European, Asian, and African indigenous cultures. Lynn, 1991, remarks that not one of the 1,500 discoveries listed in Asimov's Chronology of Science and Discovery, 1989, was made by a Negroid people. As noted, Asimov was a self-described liberal, so this omission is unlikely to be due to racism. None of the 200 most important persons in history in Michael Hart's list is Negroid. Lynn and Rushton both cite Baker's criteria for civilization, which include the wheel, metallurgy, building with stone, cultivation of food plants, roads, domestication of animals, money, laws for ensuring personal security, recognition of a right of the accused to defend himself, written language, abstract knowledge of numbers, a calendar, schools, appreciation of art and knowledge as ends in themselves, and the absence of gross superstitions, cannibalism, torture, and self-mutilation. Laying aside the honorific term civilization, it is an objective fact that only Europid and Mongolid peoples have displayed these features. European and Asian, in other words. The African physical environment contains materials from which to fabricate wheels, axles, and yokes. That no African group developed these devices, mathematics, or a calendar suggests inability to do so. I don't know if you were aware of this, that sub-Saharan Africans had not even invented a wheel. I mean, does that really take a lot of intelligence? And can you blame the white man for somehow preventing them from doing that? No one was preventing them from making a round object, from realizing, oh wow, round things roll, and if they roll, that makes things easier to transport. Let's make several of these round things. Like, this is really simple. How else do you explain it other than low intelligence due to genetics? You can't. Baker, 1974, emphasizes the dependence of a civilization's level of development on the innovations of a talented elite, but average capacities matter as well. A lone genius may distinguish two-ness, T-W-O-N-E-S-S, from pairs of hands and pairs of feet, but unless he is surrounded by a sufficient number of individuals who can learn this concept from him and transmit it to the next generation, his insight will not lead to the development of arithmetic. The absence of science and mathematics from Negroid cultures indicates not only the presence of fewer geniuses, but also of fewer non-geniuses able to preserve and amplify innovations. Afrocentrists describe the Industrial Revolution as happening to Europe, but technological innovations don't happen. They are produced by human ingenuity. And where does that come from? That the absence from Africa of advanced material culture is more than an accident is confirmed by the failure of post-colonial Africa to sustain the technology left by whites. A journalist writes, quote, While the Belgians were often consummately patronizing to their African subjects, they installed an efficient colonial administration. In time, they introduced healthcare, water projects, education, telephones, and power lines, helping to turn this once isolated village, Kikwit Zaire, into one of the most affluent and best tended cities in the core of equatorial Africa. Today, the legacy of Kikwit's colonial past is swiftly disappearing. Civilization is coming to an end there, said Rene Kinsweki, manager of Siefak, a chain of food stores, as he spoke of how Kikwit has become a dispiriting tableau of chaos and catastrophe. We're back where we started. We're going back into the bush. According to another, quote, wherever there is an African society that works on a Latin American or a South Asian level, it is because colonial influence has been prodigious. By the 1980s, there were 5 times as many Frenchmen in key jobs in the Ivory Coast as there were at independence in 1960, with French nationals holding 80% of all posts requiring a university degree. Now, however, the French are trickling out. Perhaps a democracy can take hold in a country like this, but few experts are betting on it. Different parts of Sierra Leone are run by different tribal commanders. The official government is composed of young soldiers who control the capital of Freetown and some territory beyond. The smell of dope is said to be common in the palace. The streets of Freetown aren't paved. Water and electricity services, installed by Europeans, are sporadic. The capital's few photocopy machines and faxes are therefore unreliable. Crime is rising. A Lebanese expatriate community, like the Asian one in Kenya, props up the economy and is therefore begrudged for it. No good deed goes unpunished. The empirical evidence, whether it be in literacy rates, infant mortality rates, economic statistics, or whatever, proclaims a grim truth that the whole issue of race in America makes us afraid to utter. African culture, in a modern political sense, is simply dysfunctional. End quote. A third writes of Liberia. Liberia has come to bear little resemblance to a modern state, becoming instead a tribal cauldron governed less by commonly understood rules than at any time since it became Africa's first republic in 1847 under freed American slaves. A legal authority is cited, quote, things have deteriorated to the point where what we are seeing emerge nowadays are sub-warlords, each of whom is a law unto himself, end quote. Food production in the poor African countries in 1993 was 20% lower than in 1970, because there were less white people helping them grow food, because white people are smart and know how to grow food, in case that wasn't obvious. Malnutrition in Zambia increased from 5% to 25%. Gross national product declined by 2% annually through the 1980s, and Africa's share of world trade fell from 4% to 2%. It is almost as if the continent has curled up and disappeared from the map of international shipping lanes and airline routes that rope together Europe, North America, and the booming Far East. Direct foreign investment in Africa is so paltry that it is not even measured in the latest World Bank study. End quote. Darnton, 1994. Several other countries have also sunk into chaos since these words were written. It again begs the question to explain the disintegration of post-colonial Africa with the failure of Europeans to prepare it for independence. Who prepared Europe for independence? Why aren't England and France still divided into feuding tribes? Why were Africans unprepared during the millennia before contact with whites? The situation in the Black Caribbean resembles that of Africa. Before a mulatto-led rebellion in 1804 made Haiti independent of France, the French had installed roads, bridges, and an irrigation system. These had fallen into disrepair by 1915, when the United States intervened to stabilize Haiti economically and politically. In the 72 years preceding, there had been 102 revolutions and coups. That's more than one per year. The Marines left in 1934 after rebuilding the infrastructure, setting the telephones working again, and training young Haitian men in farming skills, which the Haitians resented. American banks took over the economy, but by 1958, these improvements had been undone. A visiting historian found, quote, telephones gone, roads approaching non-existence, ports obstructed by silt, docks crumbling, sanitation and electrification in precarious decline." End quote. The situation has deteriorated since, and another American intervention has recently ended. Like Africa, Haiti has been unable to sustain Caucasoid technology because their brains can't understand it. It may be added that Scar Caparulo et al. 1983 found that West Indians in Britain perform far below white norms on school examinations. In one study, although blacks comprised 10% of the school population, none had passed any A-level examination. One can maintain that Negroids are as genotypically intelligent as whites or Asians only by claiming that African achievements did equal Eurasian achievements, and that no one realizes this fact because it is suppressed. Wakanda forever! Environmentalism thus leads unavoidably to Afrocentrism. Hacker nearly endorses Afrocentric claims about African technology, although he obliquely concedes that, quote, "compared with other continents, Africa remains most like its primeval self," end quote. More circumspect environmentalists confine themselves to the American situation, avoiding cross-cultural comparisons. Wonder why.